Okay.
I was thinking about life.
No, we're good.
Should be fine.
Great.
I think Sven's leading this session on paper.
Yeah. Well, I'll
You
post
got the
it.
paper.
Yeah.
50-50. I'll draw a line in the middle.
So the issue with the automatic IndieAuth, or there's a draft called non-interactive IndieAuth and a page called server IndieAuth. We had a few brainstorms about it already, and I went through the wiki and looked at what we had before. Like the key issue basically is that with the normal IndieAuth flow, for instance, for MicroPub, you as the user go on a website, log in, you as the user tell your endpoint that the connection is okay. And that looks great for clients you connect that way, but for things where you might want a piece of software to authenticate as an agent of you, it doesn't work so well. So an example would be a reader that wants to follow a private feed on someone's website, or wants to follow a view of a feed that includes posts that are only visible to you. That needs a way to authenticate to the site, and you do not want to log into each individual site for that manually. Like if I follow a feed, my feed reader should be able to look up can I authenticate against that feed, and then just authenticate in some way as I am an agent of svenknebel.de. Could you please give me the content that's viewable for that?
And every so often, perhaps by logging into the reader, you would refresh the tokens so that they don't expire, instead of just having permanently authenticated things.
Probably. And
well, that's actually the interesting question, which is whether or not you actually want the person involved in the flow or not, because the other way to do it is to have just sort of like delegate that once and have the server be able to manage the token itself.
Yeah.
And it's.
But then you definitely need to have a way to revoke the token.
And a variation on that, which is even more difficult, is for private web mentions, so that you can send a web mention to a private page, and my web mention endpoint can go and fetch the page, authenticate it, and do all the web mention processing.
Right.
That makes it a bit more complex, because then it's not even. With the reader, I'm triggering the action and my reader is logging in as me, whereas with the private web mention flow, the other side triggers my side to log into the site, which adds a bunch of complexity.
ActivityPub already has this kind of stuff, doesn't it?
Not really.
No, it works the complete opposite way. So instead of me fetching content from you, you push it to me. So it doesn't have the problem.
But ActivityPub is a client-to-server protocol as well as a server-to-server protocol, and
it's mostly a server-to-server protocol.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Basically, yeah. And what they do is that you can specify a proxy URL in your actors object, and that proxy URL is the URL where your server authenticates other servers on your behalf.
I haven't seen that.
So it is in the spec.
Who has implemented it?
Nobody yet.
Okay. So
it's just in the spec. But it's written there.
Okay,
we also have two specs written that are functional implementations of what we're talking about right now. I'm not convinced they're the right things because nobody's implemented them. I mean, beyond like the prototype.
But who has implemented ActivityPub at all? It's just Mastodon, Fairtube, and the photo thing.
And me.
And Ryan for Bridgie and
Pleroma.
Yeah.
Pleroma. There are lots of implementations.
But the implementations of like this much of it, not of the whole thing, right?
Yeah.
So like it's really only useful to talk about the parts of ActivityPub that they have implemented as examples of things that work well, because at least those have been built out somewhat.
Okay. Although also they specified a bit weird, because it says endpoint query, so this actor's client may access remote activity streams objects which require authentication to access. Use this endpoint, the client posts an XVV form well-encoded ID parameter, with the value being the ID of the requested objects. But on the other hand, there was a discussion about it, and it was.
I think this is a different problem. I think this is a different problem.
Maybe.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, and ActivityPub itself doesn't have the problem we're talking about because they always push content.
Well, it's not strictly required to always push. Theoretically, there's an outbox. It's just nothing does that.
So the one thing that ActivityPub does have that we could borrow from, although I'm not a huge fan of it, is the HTTP signatures, which is how they authenticate everything. Which again is not actually part of ActivityPub spec, but it's what everybody does. HTTP signatures is the part where when you go make a request, either pushing stuff or fetching things, you can sign the request with your public key, with your private key. That way the server knows that this server actually is making the request. The reason I'm not a huge fan of that is that everything else in the like on the web and with the IndieWeb technologies doesn't do its own cryptography and relies on the transport layer underneath to do cryptography. So HTTPS. We can use HTTPS to make a connection to a server, and we rely on the HTTP clients and the browsers to do that transparently so that the code that you write doesn't have to think about it. And that is safer because that means fewer people are writing broken implementations of cryptography.
Or using MD5.
Or using MD5. And also, as the cryptography community progresses and improves, those improvements also just sort of come along for the ride. So like TLS 1.1 is about to go out, right?
1.3.
1.1 is about to be dropped, deprecated. And 1.3 is replacing it. I'm not going to have to change any of my code, and I will just now suddenly get better cryptography. Because my client library handles it.
How does it compare to WebID TLS? That is the thing that Solid uses.
I think that was that I tried to use the client certificate stuff in TLS.
Oh, right.
Which has been an interesting idea, but it's kind of useless for browser users.
Well, the thing was that I was presented with a list of about 1,000 certificates from my Mac who had no idea which certificate was right, and so I always looked. What is Solid? What was?
That's really something. I think that in TLS you can authenticate both types of certificates is really more useful for between services in a data center or so, because like the browsers have decided like a decade ago that they don't really care about it. They haven't thrown it away yet because enterprise users would get pissy, but they've pretty much decided that concept is dead, so you don't really have it in browser usage.
So I think what you said is interesting of treating it as you are authorizing this thing to act as you, which is very much along the lines of an OAuth model, which is what IndieAuth has already built on.
Yeah.
And I think that's probably the right path to go down, which is not something we've done in our previous attempts at this.
My private web mention draft goes in that direction.
Kind of.
Yeah.
But it's more, what we've done before has always been like, we just try to make the server, like my server, act as itself, as opposed to me, the person, authorizing some other piece of software to then act.
The advantage of the person authorizing the software is that the software can act on behalf of multiple different people as well, because it knows, hey, for this person I'm going to do this, for this person I'm going to do this.
And it means that, especially in the case of feed readers and fetching feeds, it makes that delegation of like, I'm going to let this thing act as me, where I can then revoke that if I need to, which was not part of what we had drafted before, really.
I think that's an interesting question. If you make the difference visible to the site you're accessing, like does the feed reader act as me, or is there a step that in the protocol that tells it this thing acts with my permission?
Right.
But it has a different identity. There's reasons for both.
Yeah.
And
my preference would be that it just says like if you've authorized something to act as you, then it goes as you forward, because then you only have one thing to implement on the other end. Like, is this authenticated? Not is this and this authenticated?
Yeah, I think that's probably the right.
Which simplifies things a little bit.
So concrete use case is, so I have Aperture, which is the server that's fetching feeds, and a bunch of people are using it right now. And I would love for it to be able to fetch content where it can authenticate as somebody else. And it is also like definitely something that it's a service I run that other people are using where it's not part of their website explicitly. And it should not be treated as part of their website in the security model of it as well. So I guess I can imagine like some sort of flow where the end result is that Aperture has a thing that it can take to your site where you have a way to know that the user authorized that thing.
Yeah, so another example we had for a while, the bot I made that edits the wiki actually did IndieAuth against the wiki.
Oh, right.
I didn't track it with the latest changes, but initially it basically worked like it actually got the login form from the HTML source, but it could replace that with like a val link or something. For that, click the button, and then in the flow where it was supposed to authorize, like in the authorization step, normally in the browser, I get redirected to my authorization endpoint with a redirect URL, and then in the backend talk to my auth endpoint and token endpoint to set up that it got tokens, and just call the URL without ever having to use the web interface that it didn't see. And if that step where the software tells it, okay, I have this auth URL and the redirect, and I want that to work, then it has to tell the auth endpoint to create an auth code. So if you can make like that step is authenticated, for instance with IndieAuth with the scope of get auth tokens for read scopes, then we could use that to talk to the auth endpoint to set the authorization up.
This is again though,
and then it would get an auth, and then it would get access as me because it uses my auth endpoint.
but isn't this still the same way we were doing before, which is essentially trying to just automate the process of your server being able to do IndieAuth like the normal IndieAuth, whereas I think it's worth talking about this other model of more about the delegation from the user to the server. So the user can actually be involved in the first step. The first time.
Yeah, but in that model, it also would have to be involved in the first time to set up the connection that is to give the service a token that it can use against the auth endpoint to get tokens. I mean, in my case, I didn't authenticate it. It's software that's running on the same server and talking to the same auth code database, but it doesn't have to be that way. It could be an API between those two, which again uses tokens.
Can we try to draw out some flows of this?
Yeah.
Maybe a couple different
With a nice
ones.
fat pen.
I don't have a fat pen, I have a pen.
Yeah.
Nobody grabs the Sharpies.
It's probably just well they bleed for paper.
You got a nice pen.
I bought cheap Pilot pens.
So what we have is we have the user, we have the site, we have the user's site, we have the site that wants to be accessed, and we have the thing that wants to do the accessing, for instance, the reader.
Yeah.
Yeah, start with that.
Yeah. So.
And then there's the user with their device.
Yeah. Then we have the.
And then I'm using a reader.
Yeah.
And that reader will have to go and fetch Aaron's log feed in some way for me to read.
Yeah. Reader, we have eventbk.com, and we have
User has a site too, right?
and we have
with an IndieAuth flow for the user.
Site. Yeah. And so if the user looks at the feed at npk.com, it goes to npk.com, does IndieAuth flow, which talks to the auth endpoint on the site.
So, okay,
Yeah, but
so
the
we
auth
assume,
endpoint, doesn't have to be on the site, right?
But it is it doesn't matter.
It doesn't matter. Okay.
The site only is relevant to find the auth endpoint.
Yeah, okay, that's fine.
So I consider it part of it, even if it's running a different service.
Okay.
So yeah, the user.
So in this model, my website has to be able to IndieAuth users. Like I have a login form on my site,
Exactly.
and you can log in, and then you will see something different.
Exactly.
Okay.
And you get. Yeah, and then, I mean, in that case, you probably get a cookie and not a token, but technically you could get a token that gets put into a cookie. And it's the same. Exactly. And if the software wants to access, then we need some kind of signaling that you can actually authenticate against this thing. And then it needs to accept tokens instead of cookies. Sure.
Yeah.
For that. And then we have the bit, how does the login thing work? And so the idea, and so what my flow basically would have been the reader goes to the site, starts an IndieAuth flow with pointing to my auth endpoint. So it puts call it some Knebel talk about that. So it gives the reader doesn't put in a URL on by the reader, but the URL of knebel.de. That starts the flow, the state is set, and in the browser, a redirect to the auth endpoint is returned to the reader, which then has the redirect URL that can use to confirm that it has successfully authenticated to the user. And more or less, and this step, more or less, where I as a user would enter the password in my auth endpoint, this service has to do something to tell the auth endpoint, here, please finish the transaction that was started here for me with the redirect URL. But the redirect URL, because the auth endpoint has to add the token and the access code to the redirect URL and trigger that. So
I think there's actually two different things happening here, and I think that's where we're getting tripped up. The two things that are happening at the end of the day, I want to issue a token to you. Yeah, I want to give you a token, which means my site's generating a token so that I can validate the token, because I don't want to have to validate somebody else's tokens.
Mm-hmm.
Right. I want to write code where I can manage the tokens so I can revoke them when I want.
Yeah.
So
okay, that's a different flow. Yeah.
Yeah. So at the end, I need to issue a token, but this step is not actually about getting a token. This step is just authenticating.
Yeah. Authentic.
Yes.
Yeah. Sure.
So the end result of the first step is that
An auth code.
some software, the auth code that can be verified here,
Yeah.
that says yes, this user actually did approve this
Exactly.
request. And I think we need to separate those two,
yeah.
because
Sure.
otherwise it gets confusing, and I don't want to end up in a situation where I have to be validating tokens
Yeah.
you
Sure.
issue.
Yeah. So we stop at the auth code, and then here and basically here in this flow, So
So at the end of the authentication flow, my site needs to get an auth code.
Yeah.
That
verifies again.
Verify that the thing that started the flow is that you actually did approve the request. That you, the user, approved the request.
Yeah. And basically and for that the reader needs to be able to answer to the redirect URL with an actually working auth code. Which in the interactive flow would be the auth endpoint, but in the non-interactive it's probably the reader, which means the reader needs some way to actually create a valid code in the auth endpoint.
And I think if we're talking about the sort of idea of delegating, where the reader may also be third-party software, the step where the reader gets the code should be something the user actually initiates in a browser.
That's a question for each site. This kind of thing. Like you could.
But there needs to be a standard, because otherwise everybody's going to have their own implementation.
Yeah, I think you have different problems. So the first problem is you have kind of resources you make available. And these resources are constrained. So you need some kind of enforcing these constraints. And this is typically always computer to computer. There's never a user involved. If you have a browser, you send bits. That you can't prove that the bits come from a user. So this is the side you have on the server. And then you have to somehow identify, okay, what are the permissions to access my resources and give out the permissions to someone. And this someone can be a user, can be a program, can be some other service. And those have to store somehow these credentials they get from your side. And so you can verify, okay, I gave out these permissions and they come back, and so they get the resources I want them to see. So we have essentially three problems. One problem is securing your resources. One problem is sending the permissions to get your resources, and the third one is you at some point want to verify that a real user interacts.
Yeah. So the first one you said is an implementation. The first one you said is an implementation detail and does not need a spec, because it is your software deals with permissions however it wants, and you are ultimately giving out a thing that you then get back from some software, and you can decide to return the resources. So that is out of scope of the spec, this spec, because it is well, I mean, the amount of that we care about is how to present that authorization. And if we just follow OAuth 2 and the existing micropub stuff, it's a bearer token. So that's the extent of that. So bearer token solves that first one. Step 2, problem 2, which was, that's basically the idea that, sorry, can you rephrase your part 2 again?
I think part 2 is identifying that I have permission to access the resource.
That's the bearer token.
That's the token.
That's the bearer token.
Yeah.
That's the token.
Right. So yes, part 1 is just implementation detail. Part 2 is the bearer token, and then part 3 is the part we're talking about now, which is how do you actually give something else that bearer token? Yeah. How do you get that bearer token? How do you issue the bearer token to this other software,
So,
whether it's a browser or?
And Aaron can issue a bearer token to a reader, but he needs to know for sure that he's issuing it to a reader instance that's me, because
Delegated.
yeah, that's delegated
Yeah.
by my identity, because he wants to share something only with me, and that's the step.
That
So
could
then
be
the
done
part
with
that-
JSON Web with a JSON Web token, because that's the sense of JSON Web token is that data cannot be changed on the way, and that you know.
But then you have to have crypto again. If
So
if it has to work between systems, you have to do public key cryptography again,
Yeah,
which we want to avoid.
Of course, but it is well standardized. But yeah.
It's again one of those
Not
things
compared
where,
to TLS.
no, JWTs are something that you can use in your implementation as long as the other side doesn't need to be aware of it. So if I want to issue access tokens that are JWTs, that's a great mechanism for me to do that, because it means that I have an easy way to generate them and an easy way to validate them, and it's a relatively good library support and all that.
Yeah,
but I don't want to rely on your software also being able to parse those JWTs, because instead we should be able to have a mechanism that moves the authorization around
Zero
with
knowledge.
just opaque strings. If that makes sense.
So are we looking at one authentication per feed, or are we looking at one authentication, you get access to all the feeds? Because
That's an interesting one.
I think it should be one authentication per feed. Yes, it will suck when setting up your feed reader to start with 100 private feeds,
that
having to
depends.
authenticate it 100 times.
I mean, that depends, and it doesn't even necessarily have to be different things.
I think if I've
But
allowed
so
a
if
reader
Aaron
to-
gives me a token, I can't then give you that token to use on your website. Well, I can try, but you won't be able to authenticate it. And then we're back to the original
That's
place
true,
where
but-
you said we shouldn't be trying to verify tokens that somebody else
Yeah,
has given
but
out.
I think I have delegated the reader to do this for me, and Aaron's website has given the reader a token just for that feed, but I only had to delegate to the reader once.
Yeah.
So then I add 100 feeds, but I've already delegated to the reader, so the reader can go and get those 100 different tokens.
So
for me.
because the reader is working as me, it then talks to Aaron and says, hey,
Yeah.
I'm me.
That's
Yeah.
what
So
I
that's-
would expect, yes,
Yeah.
because
That's an
otherwise I
interesting
would
point.
have to
Yeah,
do
exactly.
the whole flow for every feed I add. I don't want that. I want to delegate once to the reader,
Yep.
And
and
then
then the reader has to pick up.
Yeah.
So there's that line here where there's the two parts. One
Yeah.
is this server needs to ultimately issue the token to the reader, but you're right that the reader should only be authorized by the user once.
Yeah.
And
It's exactly. Yes.
and then it needs a way to continuously be able to verify or to acknowledge a challenge from this in order to give it a token.
Exactly,
Yeah.
and that's what I meant here, that it needs an API and permission to, for instance, for authentication to create auth tokens,
Okay,
so
so
auth codes. And what I also noticed when we said that if you only do authentication here, then there's the problem, but that we want that then the auth endpoint doesn't have control about what kind of tokens are given to the reader. So we probably need to do some authorization flow and then use the result from that authorization flow to get the token. So
I think there's two completely separate steps.
Yeah.
There's step one,
Is delegating.
give the reader needs a thing that this thing will acknowledge when challenged.
yeah, and which basically would be I as the user probably log in with the reader into the auth endpoint and say, okay, you get like a token with scope, create tokens, read.
Got it. Yeah. So it's basically like we do normal IndieAuth step one with a special scope.
Yeah.
Issue a special scope token to the reader.
Yeah.
Now the reader has a special token. It can talk back to the auth endpoint.
Yeah.
When it needs to.
Exactly. Because
And then completely separately. So now the reader has a mechanism to talk to my auth server without me there because I've delegated it once.
Yeah.
And if I need to, I can revoke its ability to acknowledge to do whatever this thing is.
Yeah,
It's
you
not
can,
gonna
revoke,
align.
you can revoke the token you've given to the reader.
Yep.
When you revoke the token given to the reader, though, that should somehow be forced through so that the tokens that have been given to the reader are also revoked.
That's a good point. We need to figure that part out.
Yeah, but
Let's-
you can't force that because it's a third party.
you maybe
But we should be able
We
to
should be
signal
able
it in
Yeah,
some way,
okay.
shape, or form,
Yeah, you
because
can
otherwise,
signal it.
say it's been hacked for something, and there's
Yes.
private
Yeah.
stuff in there that's
Yeah.
Hmm,
You don't
that's-
you don't want to wait for expiry probably.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. That's like not even that's telling this thing that the token it has is invalid now.
So what we
which-
need is we need a mechanism where we can say,
Everything
where
was-
we can publicly say, hey, like these things are able to act on my behalf somehow, if you get an authorization from it, and then this is no longer able to act on my behalf, perhaps.
But
So,
then- but-
so
but-
token
but-
revocation is a
It's
token
okay,
to the
yes.
auth spec. and
Yeah.
It's very simple. All it is you take the token and you send it to the endpoint and tell it like this token's dead.
So
Don't
we
use
have
it
to be able to
anymore.
get the tokens out of it.
So we need
Yes.
somehow to do something like that. Although I don't think that exactly works in this case because ultimately
We don't
this
have the
doesn't
tokens.
actually have the token
No,
here.
Yeah,
so,
but
so
then-
the reader will always have to send them back to you, so you can also have your own tokens.
Or the flow gets redirected as the tokens first have to go through the endpoint and then go with the other channel.
That's right. Yeah.
That
could do
There we
even
go.
be better. Yeah.
That would
Maybe
be
that's
much
the way to
better.
do it.
Yeah, I thought that probably then that could work.
Okay.
Yeah. So the reader is always going via the auth mechanism.
So
I don't think you really want that
No.
because
Not
key
sure.
point is acting on my behalf.
Mm.
And acting on my behalf, doing on computers is very tricky.
yeah,
And so how would it be possible in real life? You write some sign, the person, blah, 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 can do things for me. And then you get that paper and say, okay, the person, I know the sign. So you have to verify the sign first. Then you have to verify the passport of the person coming to you. And in that point, you are already verifying things from other people.
Yeah, but
so
the
it's
verifying the
that-
signing you would go and verify it with me.
Yeah.
So you get a piece of, Rose comes to you with a piece of paper that says, oh, I'm Martinez, let me do this, and it's signed by me. Then you do a video call with me, show the signature, and I say yes or no, whether that's my signature or not. Because that's what the authorization endpoint would do for us.
Or
That's a good analogy,
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
You
Yeah,
can also
So
use
it's
post
not-
ident, and then you have to.
exactly. And then it's
Yeah,
then you
yeah,
have to ask
but
for-
that's because that's it.
Yeah, exactly. And then and basically, and then in the future, when she comes with the paper again, if you remember, I've seen this piece of paper before. That's basically the bearer token. And what we then need is kind of the way that is kind of a way
To
that
get you the message that
that Martina can say, hey, this piece of paper, next time you see it, burn it, instead of accepting it.
Right.
Yeah. But if you just, every time you see the piece of paper,
You
do the video
automatically
call
check.
with me, then I can just at any time say, no, that token, that piece of paper, I revoke that. So Rose might still be coming to you with that, but last week I said she's no longer allowed to.
So what this needs somehow is a way to say, hey, like, I have this token, which was issued to this token. Because this token's no longer valid, I say that these ones aren't valid.
Yeah. Yes.
Let's,
But then you have to trust some kind of central authority.
No, you
No.
trust me.
you are the central authority.
You are
you always
the
go to
central
me.
authority.
An option might be to say, okay, these tokens are only always valid for 10 minutes, and you do the dance every time, because machines do it. It doesn't matter that
They have to reel
Yeah.
500 times a day.
Yeah, like
Yes.
if he fetched in turns into 5 HTTP calls instead of 1, but
I mean, it's a server.
Yeah, it could, that,
It's not
That's-
cruelty to animals.
this the laser solution to the problem.
right.
And I think that at least it's a sign that it's really a dedicated third addition to the thing.
I think it is worth treating it as an addition to, it's like, yeah, third step, it's the way to revoke that. I'm trying to think about this in OAuth terms, since like there's a lot of work being done there to
No need
do
to reinvent
exactly
the wheel.
things like this.
Yeah.
And they usually try to also avoid crypto in the same way, where they're relying on TLS for things,
Yeah, they did
for the
it.
most part.
Yeah, they did it in OAuth 1 and decided it was a bad idea. So
Yeah, exactly. So
So I think
we still don't quite have this step of
that step.
how does this site give the reader a token even once it has. So the reader needs to request a token. This thing needs to verify. Oh, actually, that's why it makes sense to go through the auth endpoint to issue them. So if the reader is going to request a token from this server. This server needs to say, oh, does Sven actually agree that this thing that's being requested is valid? And if it does, then it issues a token and sends it back to the reader.
Yes.
And that way, this thing is aware that happened.
Yeah.
And
then
that's why this can revoke it.
okay, so it could be something like a request that contain.
I think it might be like it generates something, or maybe it has to go register that it's making a request.
But
So it takes that token that it has, because we issued this reader a token.
yeah.
It takes a token, tells the auth endpoint, I'm going to go and request a token on your behalf, so I can act as you.
Yeah.
Makes that request. This thing returns a string. The reader then takes that string over to this server.
Yeah.
And says, here is a authorization code.
Yes, an authorization code for SvenKnebel.de.
Choose a token endpoint.
Yeah.
Aaron correctly says, okay, how can I verify this authorization code? Well, I can go and ask Sven's authorization endpoint, did you issue this code?
It says yes.
It says yes. Then it sends back the token. And then this server knows that code was used successfully. And then the question is, can we use that same code
I mean,
to revoke the token?
I mean, what a code would be one option, or would be that the what also could work is that the token is sent to the auth endpoint and the reader has to request it, like that it gets associated to the code and the reader has to request
So
it.
the
from-
reader goes to
yeah.
your
Auth
auth
endpoint.
endpoint and says, I want you to fetch me a token to use on aaronpk.com.
Yeah.
That's what it
And
is.
then the endpoint does the dance and
And then my own endpoint
So there's
is gonna
no
ask.
back and forward here. It's
Mhm.
this goes here, this goes here, this goes
Yeah.
here, and this goes
Yeah,
here.
and that way I can
Does that
revoke in both directions.
The reader has a token, so it knows they can ask the auth endpoint to go
Get
get
the
a token.
Get the token for this site with the following scopes.
For the following scopes. This makes a post request to the token endpoint asking for a token.
Yeah.
That request is coming from something that this doesn't trust yet.
Yeah.
So this has to verify, which I think is just going to be asking this.
It's kind of the normal authorization flow.
Ask, hey, did you issue this code? And then that initial request gets a token in the response.
Yeah.
Now this has a token that the server issued.
And it can give it
and
back.
then it responds back to the reader.
Yeah, that token.
And then it knows if it needs to revoke the reader,
Then
the
it
reader's
just
ability to
drops
get
all of
tokens,
this.
and it can also then push that token and say it's been revoked.
Yeah.
Yeah, because it then can use the revocation function of the token endpoint to say, yeah, get rid of that.
That makes sense.
And
I think that's the right.
Yeah.
I think all the responsibility is in the right place in that flow.
Yeah, because then it's my authentication endpoint working as me.
Yeah.
So it doesn't
Yeah.
matter, like, if I decide to move my authentication endpoint, then it's up to me to make sure it works.
You have only once given the reader the ability to automatically, on your behalf, trigger the flow and go fetch a token. And of course, then you get the security question. Okay, so if you want to make sure that the reader doesn't do any rogue stuff, you have to look like, oh, what's this reader doing? It has done 20 token requests in the last 10 seconds. I'm revoking the token the reader has, and I'm going to send those 20 tokens as a revoke back to their
Well,
origins.
ideally, you would just press one revoke button, and it would say,
Exactly.
I'm revoking this reader token and all of these
Of
site
course,
tokens.
but I mean,
are done.
that's up to your implementation. Of
Yeah,
it.
Exactly. And that's
makes
true, but
sense.
that has a nice benefit that the auth endpoint really sees everything that is attempted. So for instance, technically you could give your auth endpoint a list of some maybe like a blacklist of things it's not supposed to give tokens out for.
Mm-hmm.
And you also have nicely enforced that you actually only get the proper scope. So for instance, I wouldn't want to give my reader random posting rights just because my term allowed me to post on his site. My reader isn't allowed to post on my term site, and I don't want to get in trouble with him for that. So I only said you can only get a read token or whatever scope is relevant for the use case.
That makes sense. I think that works. So the next question is, does the same thing work when there's a web mention that needs to be verified?
Yeah, that's the interesting.
Well, it's everything is the same except reader you change for web mention fetcher.
Not
Yeah,
quite.
web mention
Not quite.
verified.
The problem with the web mention is that your site sends.
I think it's exactly the same
exactly
because
the same.
ultimately
Yeah.
you're just telling.
Depends. Depends. There's kind of the complexity with the audience stuff. So it's our private web mention implementation that we did before. Basically, the fact that you got a private web mention authorized you.
Yeah, but that was like a way to essentially cut out a few steps of this process. But if we just take this process and apply it to web mention, I think it works fine.
And
basically, at the end of the day, what it is like when I send a web mention, I'm saying, hey, here's this private post. You need then a way to get a token to fetch that privite post, and you can just use the same flow.
Yeah, and we assume that the user has. If you apply to my blog, you've probably configured that my domain is allowed to read that post.
Yeah, exactly.
And my web mention endpoint assumes that for everything, it's going to try log in as me.
Yes, it does require that, which is one of the things that the previous flow did not require, which was interesting.
Exactly. That was kind of the question. If there's
the nice thing about the previous flow is that there was no identity involved.
Yeah.
It didn't actually require any identity information. There was no, I'm trying to pretend to be this user. Mm-hmm. It was just, I sent a private web mention and you can use this thing to go and fetch it. And it didn't matter who you were or who the other server was, because everything was sent only to those who needed it.
Yeah, and that's kind of the thing that it makes it might make it a bit more difficult to automatically, if you create a private reply, you would like to automatically have the right audience be set. Yeah. And that discovery step could be more difficult then, because now we need to do some discovery step, like look at the author and authorize the author. But the author might not be the web mention, but on a shared blog, the author might not be the web mention endpoint.
But you wouldn't be sending a private web mention to a shared blog.
Probably
I
not.
mean, you might.
You might. And that gets to the point, like, does then the blog have an identity that's allowed to at least verify private web mentions?
Sure, because if the blog has a view in its admin thing where you can watch private web mentions that were sent
Exactly.
to you, and I'm logged into the blog as me instead of as Aaron, then the blog can only send me, it can only display the stuff that it was sent to me.
Exactly, and then
It just becomes a reader.
yeah, and that discovery step.
As long as we can, as long as every
True,
single
yeah.
application we can say it fits in this reader box,
Sure.
then this flow works.
So you could authorize a you could authorize a different web mention endpoint to use tokens as you, and one could maybe, and to secure it only for private web mentions, one could use a different scope for the web mention verification.
Also, but there's loads of things. But one web mention fetcher can also have several scopes. Aperture is going to have several tokens for requesting stuff on behalf of different users.
Yeah, sure.
So
that also that again gets into the entire limit what it can do. Like for the shared blog, the web mention endpoint, I really only wanted to verify web mention. I don't want it to read other private feeds. I think you can solve this by scope web mention verification.
I mean,
And if you haven't sent a web mention there, then you're not going to accept that scope.
sure, but that's
So that works.
implementation.
Yeah, that's
So-
a detail, but it's all.
So my other question with this is, so I'm pretty sure that what we outlined is the right responsibility for each role. The next question is how to actually send it, because I'm a little bit worried there's too many steps for it to all happen synchronously. And I feel like some of us may need callbacks. Because essentially it's like, this thing is initiating a thing, and then it's gonna go talk to this, which then talks to this, which then talks back and back.
Yeah.
And I think that may be too many requests to do all synchronously.
The reader
I mean,
should
okay.
probably give a callback thing to the
So
authors.
I think what's gonna have to happen is every part of the step, it's like, here's the thing, I'm making a request, deliver it here when you're done.
Yeah, yeah.
Most of the time, yeah.
And then the next part takes it over,
I think in
does it
general,
again.
it's better to separate the, hey, I'm making a request, send it here when you're done, because then if something happens, I don't know, whether service is down, then you can just ignore it, because you have 3 separate services here. So if one of them is not running for whatever reason, then it's not like your thing is there waiting and then it gets a timeout and then it's like, what do I do now?
There's the interesting case that it would be nice if the reader doesn't have to. The reader, it would probably be nice if the reader also can poll, so the reader can be an application on a phone that doesn't need a server just to be able to accept
That's the
HTTP
problem with
callbacks.
callbacks.
But that could maybe be like that. Okay, the protocol also allows, hey, this is give me the current state of this transaction, and then you query every 5 seconds.
So the OAuth device flow works like that, and where because again, it's meant for devices that don't have the ability to receive posts. So we could actually do the same thing. And there's some work being done to add an extension to that so that when available, the thing can push immediately back. So we could treat it like that, where the default is a polling interface. So the reader turns into a device.
Do they use one of the HTTP push things for that? Yeah.
I don't remember what that actually is. I haven't looked at it in a while.
Okay.
But we could treat it as this thing is a device that does not have the ability to receive a post request. So when it makes that first request for, hey, please give me go get a token from Aaron's server, the response is basically a URL and a code it can poll. And then it just sits there waiting, polling, and the server's like, cool, I'm working on it, and then eventually the server will either say it succeeded or it failed for some reason.
Yeah.
Yeah,
and I
that's
think
good.
that's actually a pretty good
That's
solution
it,
to it.
that's-
Yeah.
that's
So
smart.
reader is a device. Can make a note of that.
Reader.
So really anything, but anything that could fit in the specific place of reader, whether it's a web mention fetcher or whatever, is going to act as a device in the flow.
Or at least should have the ability to do so.
So then the first step is it uses its access token. I think we can write out all these steps. So step.
Yeah, I tried
trying?
already, but it's hard.
Okay. Some flow. I like that.
Yeah, some flow.
So one
Okay.
device
Versus
uses
music.
its access token
Yeah.
to
I don't know what the
tell
hashtag was.
spend authorization endpoint to go get a token
I think it's
IndieWebCamp.
on the session grid, you know. We update everything.
Yeah, but the session grid's like.
No, the session grid digital.
In the wiki.
Oh, okay. That would be. Yeah. It's my first camp.
Step 1, use its token to request that this goes and gets a token. So it's going to include the URL aaronpk.com, which is where it's trying to go, and it's going to that's it. Yeah. Oh, and it needs to identify itself, and so probably its own client ID. And then the response is a URL and a code. So then the device polls the URL with the code to wait until the flow is done. Meanwhile, the auth endpoint now tells aaronpk.com.
It starts an authorization flow.
Starts an authorization flow, and it says this device is requesting a token.
Yes.
Yeah.
For Sven.
Yeah. So it uses the client ID of the original thing, or its own.
It may be an additional parameter.
Okay. Yeah.
I think it's a new parameter.
Okay.
Because the client ID should be it.
Yeah. Okay.
That the device is requesting a token for Sven. So that's what
well, it starts by going to the auth endpoint for the authorization flow, gets a code, and exchanges that at the token endpoint. What do you want? Like, do you want to do the IndieAuth flow like you do it, or is that overkill in this case?
So this request is not authenticated yet because anybody can make that request.
Yeah, that's why I thought it starts at the auth endpoint and to do the.
No.
I'm mistaken.
Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah.
It needs to actually generate its own code.
Yeah.
It needs to generate its own authorization code.
Yeah. True.
Because it is your authorization endpoint.
Yeah.
It generates a code, sends it to aaronpk.com, and says, "Hey, use this code to verify that this request is legit."
Yeah. And it wants a token immediately, so it goes to the token endpoint.
And it wants a token, so it goes to the token endpoint. My token endpoint goes and finds your authorization endpoint to verify the code, and then can issue the token. So do we need another polling step there, or because I think that's again too many requests?
Many requests,
That
is
can
it
be-
the same amount
that
of
can-
requests that you normally do between your authorization endpoint and your token endpoint?
Yeah, but those might be the same software, so they may not be a request.
It is a callback.
That is true. But I mean, in the spec, it's exactly the same.
It doesn't have to poll. It can be a callback.
This
Because both are
That one can be a callback because it has to be.
both are
server.
servers, so
Yes.
it can be a callback.
So make it a callback. That's fine.
So the authorization endpoint generates its own code.
Certain code.
We're over time. We need to switch sessions.
Yeah.
Are we? Isn't that 3 minutes left?
Nope.
It's supposed to end at 2 and start at
Yeah, I
2:10.
missed.
Okay. Yeah.
Oh, it's a 10-minute thing.
And a callback URL.
Shall I tell the other group that we're about to?
Sure. So then my token endpoint can go ask your website, what is your authorization endpoint?
Yeah.
And then go ask the authorization endpoint, is this code valid? If the code is valid, then it can send the token to the callback URL.
Oh, yeah. So right, there has to be in the token request. There also has to be a me for my domain, so the
Yep.
auth endpoint can be discovered.
Yep.
Okay, I think I diagrammed that in 6 steps.
Oh, thanks. Let's get back to the camera.
They're also doing a final round around the table. So.
Okay. So
I think I got it. I might have missed
Yeah.
something.
User delegates to the reader, which is standard flow.
Oh, yeah, so that is the normal IndieAuth.
Yeah,
flow,
yeah,
which is great.
which is why I didn't
Yep.
bother to document it again. That's
Perfect, so that gives a token to the reader. The reader says, that's the auth endpoint. I want to work as, X is the user.
Yeah, yeah. So,
I
and
want
then
to
it
work as
says,
the user.
I think I skipped number 2. Sorry. Yeah, that's number 2. And then that's number
Yeah.
3. Yes or no?
Here,
Then it talks-
where's, oh, right.
Yeah, I missed the step.
Yes,
somewhere.
the step where the auth endpoint actually goes and requests with the token endpoint.
Yeah,
of
yeah,
this
that's the
website.
bit
That's gone.
Yeah, that's the bit I missed. But other than that, I think I got most of it as a diagram. I will work on prettifying it later so we can put it in the wiki.
Pretty diagrams on the wiki.
So one thing would be that it can choose if it wants to call or call back.
That's gonna
Right,
be first.
so the initial device.
Like because
It
if I'm
seemed
a
like a
website,
good
I don't
idea
want
at the
to call,
time. Now I'm
especially
actually
if I'm
diagramming
in
it. It
something
seems
that
like a
doesn't have
bad
good
idea.
background
Whatever, we're running
processing,
on
that's really annoying.
Way to go.
Aaron, I've got just one question. If IndieAuth would find no realm URLs and no authorization endpoint, but the user who is requesting it has an activity path implementation, there is that actors JSON, and currently my Node.js IndieAuth implementation goes then for the discovery of the application LD JSON for that actors JSON, and then it could fetch the authorization endpoint as well as the realm links from that actors JSON, just as a third option, because then you could then all of these 1.7 million Mastodon people could use it and so on, and don't have to care about setting the realm links in the header either or in the body.
I mean, you're basically describing then more something like Indie login, is specific.
No,
Yeah, you're
both.
talking about
Yeah,
IndieAuth.
basically both.
Because IndieAuth doesn't say anything about how the user authenticates.
IndieAuth has nothing to do with realm either.
It's
So the IndieAuth spec is just the ability for a user to authenticate as a URL.
Yeah.
So Indie login.
or IndieAuth.com.
Yeah.
One part of IndieAuth.com is the annoying thing with the naming.
Yep. But I think that also Mastodon already includes HTML realm in all those URLs they enter in the HTML. So I think it already works.
They do, but that is specific to Mastodon, not
Yeah.
to the activity path.
Yeah, that's true.
Protocol.
In the process.
I thought if it is specified in the protocol, it could be a third option.
Interesting. I'll think about that.
Yeah.
I'll take this paper.
Okay,
and
what sessions
jump
are
in
happening
code.
next?
Okay.
I got distracted.
Geo
Great.
and